Margaret, I've been very much looking forward to talking with you today. How are you doing?
I've been looking forward to it too. I'm fine. I'm in a slightly nervous state that one has between finishing a book and it coming out and wondering, will everyone think I've lost my mind, or will it feel like just the book that we need right now, and everything in between? So very preoccupied with logistics rather than ideas, sadly.
Oh, that's fun.
Yeah, well, it's a good distraction in a way.
Yeah.
But I said to a friend last night, I think I need to start another book because I'm slightly driving myself mad.
Just to get yourself off this horrible bit so you can get to the good bit of the next project.
Yeah, exactly.
That's one way to move through it. So before we dive in, I'd love to ask what you sense or suspect or feel is going on in the global human psyche, if we can play with that frame.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, partly because I'm not sure there is a global human psyche.
Okay.
I'm much more sensitive to the sort of UK, US psyche, or maybe even European, dare I say, European psyche. But I wouldn't pretend really to know what's going on in it. And of course, that completely leaves out, 2/3 of the universe or the world. I mean, clearly everybody is feeling pretty shaky, that some of the goalposts are moving, some of the eternal verities seem to be a bit wobbly. I was thinking this today, it's quite interesting how in the UK we have a lot of people apologizing for bad manners, and in the US we have bad manners being normalized, and thinking there's clearly an awful lot of social norms in play, so that people are feeling as if the kind of centering points are either moving or gone. And so my sense, from the people I talk to, from the CEOs I mentor, from the stuff I read, is everyone doesn't quite know what the heck is going on. And I'm rather ambivalent about this, because I feel that on some level, being honest that we don't know what is going on might be more truthful than some of our certainties in the past.
Yeah. So before we started recording, as is often the case with these interviews, we got into some very juicy territory. And I'd love to maybe start there before we go into the questions that I'd officially prepared for our conversation today. And we were talking about our creative practices and sort of ways in which to engage in a different way. And you were talking to me about your collaging, and I was talking about my painting, and ways in which they're almost, well, I would certainly think of it in this way, as an antidote to kind of this automation and pinning things down. And you mentioned categorization and how we have this need to categorize. And can you speak a little bit about that? Because I think it plugs into this sense of uncertainty that you just mentioned, and to this sense of things that maybe we'd held as truths are feeling quite wobbly, and what we can do in response to that.
Yeah, I've been thinking about this in particular in the context of our obsession with numbers. I was reading something this weekend, which was a study of the leadership characteristics that people thought were important. It was a list of 100. And I looked at this list and I just thought, who on earth thinks this is useful? And I mean, because I certainly didn't. I didn't think 100 characteristics that include things like integrity and fairness and problem solving, 100 of these things that leaders need to have. I just thought ranking them and putting data points against them struck me as, just a deeply futile activity. But clearly somebody thinks it matters.
Yeah.
And I thought, well, okay, so why do they think it matters? I think they think it matters because if you can assign numbers to things and you can put them in an order, then you somehow feel you know something. But actually you don't know anything. So there's a lot of data, but there's no knowledge and there's no insight. There's just data. But I think somehow over the last maybe 20, 30 years, we've become persuaded that, well, data is where truth resides. So if you have a lot of it, you have the means to glean the truth. And it just made me think a lot about the degree to which people are super anxious. So that's part of what this is. But largely it's just a desire to somehow pin down the intangible. And the truth is, it doesn't really work. I can look at this list of 100 very important characteristics of leadership. I can't think of a darn thing to do with it. I mean, I could go through and think, do I have that? Yes. Do I have that? No. Am I a leader? No, I'm not. Yes, I am. No, I'm not. I guess if I were in HR, I might start thinking about, could we turn this into a psychographic test? And then can we match people's profiles with it? And certainly people are going to design tools like that because there's money in doing it. But will you actually know anything? And I think this desire to pin stuff down is a desire to feel like you have knowledge without having to think about it.
Yeah. I mean, it's so interesting you're talking about that desire to pin down. And I think there's also a huge amount of that, sort of another element that connects to that when you speak of it in my mind. And it's linked to performative displays, like on LinkedIn, for instance. There's such a flurry, and also AI making it easier to generate so much bollocks all of the time and then comment using it.
There weren't enough.
I know. And I'm just like, this is just a cesspool of derivative, homogenous, unimaginative. It's suddenly just gotten really bad really fast. I mean, obviously there's a wave towards it, but there's something about, and you mentioned, I feel like you kind of touched on this, that this desire to pinpoint or describe or categorize or name every single possible thing so that then suddenly we have a handle and we can respond accordingly. And there's something about, I'm reading at the moment at the very beginning because I'm spending more time creating than kind of taking things in at the moment, but The Master and His Emissary, which is a book written by Emma Gilchrist. Right. And one of the things that he talks about in the book is kind of almost like this battle that we have for, on the one hand, categorizing, naming, grasping, abstracting, using language, being goal-oriented. And on the other kind of end of the spectrum, this sense of being with the mysterious, with the numinous, with the creative, with the not knowing. Right. And I think there's something really curious about what happens when we become so allergic or aversive to the idea of, or defensive against the idea of not knowing, that it then weakens us.
Yes.
I don't know what your thoughts are on that, and then I'll ask you about your book.
I think you're definitely onto something. I mean, there are a couple of thoughts that go through my head. The first is that, clearly in the last 30 or 40 years, we've lived through an era of incredible scientific and technological discovery and invention. And also at the same time, some very, very good science writing. But I think that language has now become so powerful a mindset. It's as though no other way of thinking is deemed meaningful. So if you can't nail it down scientifically, it kind of doesn't exist. Or it certainly doesn't matter because you can't prove it. Right? If the only thing that matters is what can be measured.
Yeah.
Well, then I don't need to care anymore about, my kids or my neighbors or strangers or friendship. Paintings are just price tags. Music is just airwave vibrations, and, love is just a chemical reaction. So it's not intentionally, but I think if it becomes the only language that we have, it becomes narrowing and depletive.
Yeah.
And it puts us on the defensive, because if only things that matter have to have a number against them, then all the things that really do matter become irrelevant.
Which is crazy. It's such a weird inversion.
Well, I mean, the other way I would put it, which is in a way an awful lot simpler, is that it's as though we've looked at the mess in which we find ourselves and decided that what we have to do is double down on everything that got us here.
Yeah.
Now, that's kind of mad.
Yeah.
And so, the new book that I'm waiting to see, because I gather it's out. I just haven't seen it yet.
No, really? You've not got like an advanced
yet. No, sadly.
Brutal.
But other people have, so that's good. I hope they like it. It's very much about the need to retrieve that, first of all, in ourselves, and then in our decision making, because all of the important decisions we have to make cannot be made from one perspective alone. It's too risky.
Yeah.
There's too much that we overlook. And, and this has kind of taken me back to my roots, as it were, in the sense that I think this obsession with measurement is another aspect of willful blindness, which is it is a determination to see the world through one lens or language, rather than the many that we have developed over centuries.
So Embracing Uncertainty, which is this exciting new book, which you've not seen, but other people have, what moved you to write it? What was the kernel behind it?
It was a whole bunch of things. It was partly going around and talking about my previous book, Uncharted, and having a lot of very good discussions with people about the fact that once you absorb the reality that we do not know the future, that there is no data set for the future because it hasn't happened yet, that huge swathes of life are intrinsically unpredictable, then it seems to me that you can't but start to think that in that case, you need a lot of imagination. You have to be able to imagine what the future could be like. And if you need a lot of imagination, that's a very different way of thinking.
Yeah. And
many of the organizations and CEOs and leaders that I talked to about this definitely got it. I mean, much, much more so than I anticipated. And then I got a response that I had not at all anticipated, which was, but the thing is, Margaret, that we hire all these young people and they've gone to great universities, they have wonderful degrees and grades and all that jazz, and they're highly credentialed, but they just want to follow instructions. And they don't, and we look to them for creative thinking, but we don't really find any. And I remember one of them saying, they're fine. They're very good at following instructions, but I don't know what we're going to do with them when they're 35.
Is this a generational thing, you think, or is this something which has been kind of fairly consistent?
What he meant was, as entry-level people, they could get a lot of work done. But when you then want that next level of thinking, he had no sense of their capacity for that.
Wow.
And I kept finding that everywhere I went. And I thought, okay, so this is a real problem. I also, I have to say, noticed it in some of my university students that I taught, which was this craving for, if we do a presentation, do you want slides? I don't care. Do you want us all to take part or just a few? I don't care.
Wow.
Should it be about one company or all the companies we're visiting? I don't care. It's all up to you. It's all up to you. And they'd completely freak.
Too much of a blank slate, perhaps.
Yeah. And I thought, and I would explain to them, that is part of the point of this exercise, which is, I'm really interested to see how you're going to analyze the companies you visited, but I am just as interested in how you're thinking about it. And that clearly, and this is no disrespect to them because they were bright and they were definitely up for it, but they'd never been asked to do it before. It was something that nobody had invited previously. They'd always said, the essay has to be this number of words on this kind of paper and this sort of spacing, and it does or doesn't include the references or the footnotes or whatever, and it doesn't include the captions for photographs or graphs or the matrices. I mean, it was just in so much detail and it was in that much detail because over the years, those were answers to all the questions that they got from students. And so I thought, so this is a level of anxiety which their teachers are trying to allay with good intent, but actually it's a disaster because it's saying, essentially, this is exactly what we want the answer to look like. But when you're thinking about the future, you don't know what you want the future to look like. Yeah. And then I did this fascinating interview with the president of University College London. And we were talking about this, and he had observed exactly the same thing. And this is one of the top universities in the world, right? Yeah. And he put the blame at criterion-based assessment, which was a form of grading which was introduced in order to be fairer. But essentially, the premise of criterion-based grading is there is a model answer, and the closer you get to it, the higher your grade. But we're facing questions where there is no model answer.
Yeah. Yeah.
So being an expert second guesser just won't give us what we need today. So then I go back and think, okay, so that's why, if one needs to think about this in a utilitarian way, that's why developing the capacity for imagination and for creativity becomes so absolutely urgent. Because if you can only be thinking about what you've already seen, then the only answers you have are old ones.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that ties into so many things. One of the things that I've been really digging into in the last 6 months in particular is this conversation between creativity and AI. And most people, when they think about AI in a public-facing context, it's bots or it's generative AI. And of course, all of that is based on historical information. And it's not that humans don't source historical information to then make decisions and predictions about the future, like in the example that you gave with these criteria. But also they go through the filter of our bodies, which are constantly in flux, in relationship to our environment, which is constantly in flux, and in relationship to all sorts of things that lie way beyond the horizon of our conscious awareness. And so I think there's something in that about how, for instance, we're turning to AI increasingly, these other tools, to kind of give us a sense of stability and certainty, but using only historical information, which usually is outdated, which then I think in a lot of ways narrows the potential paths forward. And then potentially, because so many people adopt the same thing, because we're using so many of the same services, it can kind of calcify into only a few different kinds of positions, which I would imagine only makes worse what you're describing, which is this kind of give me all of the parameters and then I'll give you the one possible right answer that it could be because everything else has been shuttered in. Yeah. How do you find, and I know we're going slightly off piece, but to your point around creativity and categorization and working towards criteria, with this now becoming such a tempting thing to just offload our cognitive effort to machines, what are you finding as some of the most important skills when you're mentoring CEOs and people that they're potentially mentoring? What are some of the most important skills that you think people should be focusing on, or practices, tactical practices to help them cultivate this?
Yeah. I think that's really, it's a very wonderful question. I mean, it's certainly making time to think. And there are any number of ways to do that. Most of the artists that I know think by taking a walk. The same is true of most musicians. And it's not that it's not that the musicians are thinking about music. They're thinking about all sorts of things.
Yeah.
But it's very well understood neurologically that when you look away from a problem is usually when you solve it. It's when you provide time for yourself not to be focused that your brain will find the thing that actually you really need to think about right now. Most writers talk about how this is how their ideas for books emerge, is not consciously, but ideas, themes, characters, images that just keep coming back and back and back and back. So I would say the very first thing is having that time in which ostensibly to be thinking about nothing. For me, it's certainly reading. So I read a lot. And I typically will read about an hour first thing in the morning before I get out of bed in order to, just because it's a very nice way to start the day and it's a very quiet way to start the day. So that's quite important. I think that, what else? I think breaking habits is a really great exercise. One of the things I'm writing about at the moment is the pluses and minuses of routine and habit. And it's not that they're absolutely one thing or the other. They're both good and they're bad. But I think if you're feeling really stuck, breaking a habit can be a fantastic liberation. I mean, if you just vary your way to work, you will see something different. And the next time you go back to your old way of walking to work, you will see something different. You will hear something different. I'm a very, very, you probably know this, kind of great champion of monotasking. I don't think you should walk down the street listening to music. I definitely don't think you should walk down the street doing Zoom calls, which I definitely observed.
Oh my God.
I have a sort of mantra, which is be where you are.
Yeah.
Be where you are. Be bored. When you're going to get a coffee, sit down for 5 minutes in the coffee shop and just drink the coffee. Just pay attention. Pick up the vibe. Look at people. What are they thinking? Where are they? Who are they? So be in the world, because as much as all this data is going to tell you, the being in that coffee shop for those 5 minutes is going to tell you a very great deal if you look.
There's something about the quality of paying attention, isn't there? I think.
Yeah. I mean, I also have this is my routine, which is, I live outside of London, so I'm frequently on trains into or out of London. And the first 15 minutes, I have a sort of rule for myself, which is I just have to stare out the window.
Oh, lovely.
Now, it's always different. I'm often fairly wound up by the time I get on the train. So it's a good way to relax. Sometimes I listen to other people's conversations. I'm an inveterate earwigger. Sometimes I just look at the countryside. Sometimes I just listen to the racket in my own head.
Yeah.
Until it calms down. All of it's useful. It all ends up being used somewhere. It's just I don't know where.
Back to that piece around the mystery.
Yeah.
So I'm going to return back to my questions, even though my mind is going in so many different rabbit holes right now. But while researching questions for this conversation and looking at your extraordinary tapestry of a life, which is just, it's exhilarating to read, actually. And I've only kind of, when this episode goes out, I'll only have a distilled version of your biography. But not only are you professor of practice at the University of Bath School of Management, you're also a frequent broadcaster on BBC Radio 4. You write for the FT. You've authored, and I was so excited about this, broadcast plays, and you also serve as a parish councillor. So clearly you are a polymath. And I'm very curious if you notice or sense that there's a thread, like a golden thread of continuity between all of these different expressions of who you are in the world.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very good question. I think if there is a golden thread, and I think two things. First of all, I think one only sees the thread looking backwards.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. It's not a plan. It's not a strategy. It makes sense when you look back. It definitely doesn't make sense to me moving forward.
Right.
What I would say is, I really love thinking, but I want to do the thinking in order to take action. And I really love taking action, but I don't like taking action without the thinking. So it becomes a kind of circular thing, which is I think about something and then I think about, well, if this is what you believe, what should you do? And I have a very perhaps old-fashioned belief that if you write something, you have to believe in it. And if you believe in it, then you have to act on it. So I'm not just flying kites. And it makes my writing harder for me anyway.
Yeah.
Because I have to think, do I really, really, really believe this is true? Yeah. And if so, what does that mean I need to do? So there's a sort of zigzag line between an idea and an action. And then, of course, when you've taken the action, now you learn something else.
Yeah.
So now you have a new idea. So now you have a different action to make. And so it becomes this sort of zigzag between periods of a lot of kind of quiet isolation thinking time, interspersed with frantic bouncing around the place doing stuff time.
Yeah.
So, I'm currently embroiled in this project which emerged from writing Embracing Uncertainty, which is trying to negotiate a collaboration between an arts university and a science university, which is intensely interesting, intensely frustrating and difficult and confusing. And every now and then I want to throw my toys out of the pram and just think, oh, why did I ever start this? It's so hard. And other days I just think, oh my God, this is the best project in the whole history of the human race. And everything in between.
Yeah. And
similarly with the parish council stuff that I do very locally, which has huge jeopardy attached to it, because I could, deeply, deeply piss off all my neighbors if I'm not super, super careful. So it's difficult on many, many fronts. I could very easily just not do it.
Yeah.
Except then what would I do if I believe the stuff that I write about, and I do believe it is important to take action on certain things?
Yeah.
Then if I'm not doing this, what am I going to do? And maybe there is something better I could be doing, but until I can think of what that is, This is teaching me a great deal about working alongside lots of people who are very different from me in a very difficult environment in which I have absolutely no power. And I think that's a great experience. And I think it's an experience anybody in leadership ought to have frequently.
That's quite confronting for a lot of people, I think, especially the lack of power, the not knowing the potential for risk, for things to blow up in one's face.
Yep. I just think I think if I'm going to write about this, then I have to be prepared to face the music myself. Otherwise, it's just posturing.
Yeah. A lot of people are very good at posturing, I've come to find.
Well, I guess, it's just me. I'm not saying I'm better than people who write differently. I just I guess I have a very 19th century view
Yeah.
that writing is about telling the truth.
Yeah.
And if it's
Yeah.
the truth, then it has to be how you live.
Yeah.
And
I love
so
that.
that's a test.
So just very briefly, before we move on to some other possibly more interesting questions, but I couldn't not ask you this because I get asked this too, and I've got no idea how I answer. How do you manage your time? Like, honestly, because
Badly.
clearly not. I mean, maybe it feels chaotic to you, but you kind of show up on all these places and.
Yeah, I mean, it does often feel chaotic to me.
Uh-huh.
I know that it isn't intrinsically.
Okay.
I know that after years of living this way, that it does actually all connect. But mapping out how it connects is a complete waste of my time. It just,
Yeah.
I trust the system because I've seen that it's very productive for me.
Yeah. Okay.
So that's part of it. I mean, mostly what I try to do is I try to do thinking work in the morning.
Huh.
And I try to do everything else in the afternoon because I'm very much a morning person. If I'm writing something, I'm going to do much better to do that early in the morning.
Interesting.
I'll spend the rest of the afternoon, it'll be at the back of my head, being chewed over in some inchoate way. But for the most part, I like to have big blocks of time in the morning when what I'm doing is up to me. And that will be whatever's most urgent or most on my mind or whatever. And certainly if I'm writing by about 2:00 in the afternoon, I'm going to be tired. And then all the logistical stuff and the technical stuff and the marketing stuff and so on, I can do that in the afternoon.
Yeah.
So generally speaking, that's how it works. Generally speaking, I do not work at weekends, and I probably work about a 9-month year, which is to say I take about 6 weeks off over Christmas, and I take about
Lovely.
6 weeks off over the summer. I read intensively in the summer. I mean, I basically read and swim is what I do in the summer.
That sounds blissful.
So, but it has taken me a long time to get into anything that even begins to resemble anything like a routine. And there are days or weeks where it just gets blown up.
Yeah. Yeah. By other stuff that's going on. Well, thanks for sharing that with me. That is actually very interesting because it helps to kind of start to introspect on when to dedicate what activities to what time of the day. So we touched briefly on this at the top of our conversation about the promise and potential and also the risks of AI, but especially where it pertains to creative domains. I know all domains can be encountered or engaged in creatively, but if we think about the kind of classic, perhaps not so classic, but video games, art, music, films, and then the kind of creative industries, quote unquote, like marketing, advertising, how do you understand creativity, especially because this is such a rich theme in your books and your writing and your thinking? And do you think that AI can somehow replicate, replace, or synthesize or mimic or actually do some form of creativity itself?
Yeah.
And if that's not an interesting question, like whatever kind of arises for you in response to that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there are at least two ways, and probably a million ways to tackle it. I guess the first thing I think of is, so if I think about what's creativity, I think it's some mysterious and probably chemical interaction between what's going on in my head and what is happening in the great outside world. And I think this is one of the kind of philosophical problems with AI, which is that art emerges from people living in the world.
Yeah.
It doesn't emerge just from the artist. It emerges from the artist's experience every day in the world. And capturing those sorts of, that gigantic panorama of information is impossible. Your models would be as big as the world.
Yeah.
Right. And given every single person walking on the face of the earth has a different model in their head, it's kind of infinite, especially because it changes every day. So this is, complexity beyond complexity. is where creativity comes from. It's much easier to think about how you stop creativity than to think about how you start it. But I think that in the context of AI, AI is always based on models. Models are always a reduced representation of reality. So you're always going to come up with something that is limited in ways that human imagination isn't. And then, to your point earlier, is based on the past because there is no data for the future. So in some strange way, it's always historical. By the time you've got it, it's over, right? So I that's how I think of creativity, as something that's constantly being churned out and rewritten in our minds every day, all the time, which is this interaction between us and the context outside. I think there are many dangers. I chair the board of the Collecting Society for Visual Artists. So this is about collecting royalties for visual artists. And in that community, AI is both seen as a tool. I can get a lot of sketches made using AI, which kind of tells me don't go there, go here, or whatever. My son's a musician. He'll use it to just kind of try stuff out, but he'll never use the product. He'll just use it as a sort of accelerated sketch pad because it sounds almost instantly generic and kind of instantly dull. I think there are huge risks in it, and many people have talked about the many, many kinds of risks that there are. I think the greatest risk is that we lose our confidence in our own creativity, and then we lose our own creativity completely. And the analogy I think of is, we are capable of cooking good food, and we are capable of consuming processed food. And sadly, the world has mostly been persuaded to eat vast amounts of processed food, which it turns out is pretty bad for us. Well, we could start to adopt processed thinking instead of doing our own. And it's very well understood in the tech community that what you outsource to technology, you lose yourself. So I think it's possible not only that artists completely lose the ability to be paid for their work, which is an imminent and present danger, but that we lose as free-thinking individuals the capacity to discover our own creativity. In the same way that, the more you use predictive texting, the less it's you who's writing the text. And in that is a loss of freedom and identity.
Yeah. I'm starting to read some interesting papers that are now coming out. I think the first one was in October 2024. Different ways in which AI-generated content of various forms are both reflecting some of the issues that we face and then worsening them. But also it's quite interesting when you start to pick apart what's actually happening. So there was this interesting study that looked at people's responses to reading real Shakespeare and Bronte and that kind of body of that canon of work, and then reading AI-generated writing in the style of Shakespeare and Bronte, etc. And people ostensibly preferred the AI-generated one because it was more digestible. And you go, okay, well, that's just looking at one, talking to your thing about like quantifying very specific levels or layers of data. I was like, okay, well, that's one layer of data. And then you hear people like the CEO of Suno, which is this music making app. He said the most ridiculous thing. I'm like, Oh, what a twat. He basically was like, no one likes making music anymore. The pain of like getting the guitar and learning how to do it. And I'm a musician. I was trained on Suzuki violin from the age of 3, and I used to cry to class. I used to hate it. I had a really strict teacher, but it gave me access to music. And I've written various albums. I play guitar and I sing. And there's something about the challenge, or same with painting, of really, or sitting and writing a book. And some days you are banging your head for weeks sometimes against a brick wall, thinking, why am I doing this? And then you somehow get to the joyful part of the struggle and you're like, yes, this is why. And there's something about that I think that a lot of this, we think about how people are responding to AI, that we miss a lot of that sense of growth, of possibility, of encountering the edges of one's own capacity and knowledge and skill and sight and feeling capacity. And then we go to that edge and we realize there's more. It's almost like reaching into the infinite, just beyond the horizon, just one step at a time. And if we allow this kind of, and this is going to be my next question, I suppose, like the noose of our awareness to tighten.
Yes.
Then we are creating a noose for ourselves in quite strong ways, I think.
Well, I would agree with that entirely. And I think, it is the consumption of industrialized fast food as opposed to cooking real food for yourself. But I would also say, first of all, the thing that nobody likes making music. It's absurd. The world is full of people who don't have to learn how to make music and choose to.
Yeah.
And part of what they learn in the process of it is that it's hard.
Yeah.
And they learn 2 things. One is the resilience, which keeps you at it.
Yeah.
Which is a very fundamental aspect of human life and essential. We get nowhere if we don't develop our resilience. And you only develop resilience by encountering difficulty and overcoming it. Mm-hmm. But it's also in the difficulty that we find out who we are and what's in that music.
Yeah.
I've written, in my book, I've written a lot about, and Seamus Heaney writes about this much better than I do, of course, that the point of art is to create an alternative which we can inhabit and kind of try on, like a jacket, and think, well, is this me or not? How do I feel wearing this identity if I'm watching a play or reading a Shakespeare character? Mm. How is this character different from me? Is that what I would say? Maybe I wouldn't make that choice. Toni Morrison talks about readers as her co-conspirators, that what she's creating isn't a book. What she's creating is the chemical reaction between the book and the reader. Mm. And it's only in that moment that the art exists. Before that, it's just a bunch of paper with a lot of words on it. Mm. It's when I'm reading the words that it turns into something in me with her, which is why we are co-conspirators. And that changes me. And I'm reading it because I want that experience. Mm. Now, it doesn't sound to me like your CEO who says nobody wants to learn how to play music anymore has ever even had that experience.
That's what I'm wondering. Yeah. That people who make such claims, it feels like just a claim from someone who's just alien to that experience.
It's not about consumption.
Yeah.
It's about the interaction. It's looking at a painting, like the painting you showed me, and thinking, well, what was Natalie thinking about when she was painting that painting? And what was on her mind? And why is the hair on one side of the painting and not in the center of the painting? And what does it make me feel? And did it make Phil feel like that? And if so, I wonder what it was. And that's the moment at which you and I meet. Mm. That's the whole point, right?
Yeah,
of the painting. It's not to have a canvas with a picture on it. Yeah, you can mass produce that. But the experience of interacting with your mind and my mind, that's where the action is.
So
and
there's some,
not
sorry,
doing
go on.
that,
Yeah.
just having it delivered to you on a plate, is just consumption.
Yes. Yes. Sorry for interrupting. I get excited. I was thinking about how, for instance, there's kind of media that connects and then media that becomes an intermediary that then distances. And I was thinking about, for instance, with the book, I'm going to try and kind of weave several things together here. I remember seeing like it was on Instagram the other day, someone who had written some version of this. I'm going to paraphrase, but it was like, have you ever thought how wild it is when you're writing a book? You're basically reading black symbols, usually on dead tree, and hallucinating wildly someone else's dream.
Uh-huh.
And I thought this is just because we're so familiar with that type of object that we just don't necessarily see it from that perspective. But thinking about that as something that brings people together, or for instance, I'm not massively, well, apparently I am. I never thought I was massively into 17th century Dutch portraits. Like, it's just, never struck me. I'm much more into like the late 1800s, pre-Raphaelites and Miguel Blay and William Waterhouse. And all that. Like, that's the period that I'm very attracted to. Not in terms of women's rights and science, but in terms of aesthetic, let's say, culturally speaking. But I went to the National Gallery several years ago now, and I saw this painting it was beautiful. It's quite small, smaller than life size. And it was this extraordinarily handsome, probably 30-something-year-old man with a green background. And it was so compelling. I had to stand there. I was literally for 10 minutes. I've not looked at an influencer, like one of these kind of for more than a few seconds. And yet this painting was reaching through time, as you said, like kind of creating this alchemical connection between the person who painted it, their sitter, and me. And this person is long dead. The person who painted it is long dead. And there's something about the connecting quality of that versus this kind of very sort of your idea of the processed food thing. It's a great analogy, but like this kind of it's preserved in such a way that it diminishes its ability to nourish somehow. And I feel like the same thing with AI. Like it goes off of all this stuff that's been preserved and calcified, and then it aggregates something, creates something, outputs it. And it's an intermediary that doesn't connect or land in the same way.
Yeah.
So I'm keen to ask you, and we kind of touched on this in some way, but what do you think is, and especially curious how you connect this to the business side of things. Do you feel that uncertainty and mystery are important in whatever direction you want to take this question? And if so, why?
Well, I think they're incredibly important because I think that in uncertainty lies possibility. And when I say that to a lot of people, they just look completely baffled, which I can appreciate because it took me a long time myself to understand this. I guess, it really starts with a sort of thought experiment I did one day when I was on a train station waiting for the train to arrive. And a typical announcement, the next train to arrive on platform 2 will be the 0632 for London Paddington. And I think, I don't know why I thought this way, but I did. I thought, wouldn't it be interesting if actually I could have an announcement for everything that was ever going to happen to me in the rest of my life, just like that, and you will get on the train and this is what will happen and this is what will happen. And all of that all laid out for the rest of my life to the moment that I died. And I thought it would be horrible.
Yeah.
Be absolutely horrible. It's like life is just a big, long to-do list and you just go through crossing things off. And of course, in that list, there is no freedom. There are no choices. But there is tons of certainty. And I think that's when I kind of got it. When I thought, that's a nightmare.
Yeah.
That is a nightmare. And, and I also know that, most people, strangely enough, don't want to know the day that they're going to die. Most people do not want to know when they get married, or if they get married, whether their marriage will last or not.
Mm.
A very large proportion of people don't know if they're having a baby, don't want to know what gender it's going to be. And many don't want to do genetic testing. In other words, they want the discovery, and they want to discover not just, what the marriage is like, or the child is like, or whatever, but they want to discover in themselves who they are. But if it's all certain, then there is no opportunity for that discovery. And then I started reading a lot of Carlo Rovelli writing about physics, and his notion of science as uncertainty being the only area in which discoveries are to be made. That uncertainty is the great propulsive power behind science. And I think it is the great propulsive power behind art, which is, if I have this idea, can I do it? And what is it really? There is only one way to find out, which is to do it.
Yeah.
You can't think your way to a painting, and you can't think your way to a scientific discovery. You simply have to go out and explore. And of course, that is where all human invention has happened. So the very last thing we want is a life with all uncertainty removed.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So we've got about 10 minutes left of this conversation, and I've got quite a few questions. I'm wondering if I give you like I'm gonna give you a couple to choose from. You can tell me which one most piques your fancy. We'll do like pick your own adventure style. So I wanted to ask you about, I don't think I want to ask you about preparing for unpredictability, because I think people need to read your book, Uncharted, all your books. One of the things that you mentioned when we had a conversation before this call was around the wider context, which includes neoliberal economics and how it's impacted our priorities. That's one option. And the other was around the implications of the quantification of self, which we've kind of touched on a little. And then I also want to ask about agency and creativity. Where do you want to go next? Before I consolidate the last
I
question.
can take any of those pretty, I think, famous last words.
All right, let's do all of them.
I mean, the first thing I'd say about neoliberal economics is I think it was based fundamentally on the notion of the individual as the unit of production. And I think we've living through an age of peak individualism. I think it hugely has impacted our priorities. I think it's contributed to our antisocial behaviors, our lack of concern for others, our lack of concern for the planet. It's certainly made us more competitive, or encouraged our latent competitive instincts. And once you introduce competition into the ethos of life, you hugely amplify the need for measurement, because I want to see, am I winning or not? Yeah. So I think that has become kind of the narrative of certainly my age. And of course, that brings you to the quantification of self. How much is my net worth? A really explosive concept. What kind of net worth? Right? Have I made more money than other people? Do I have more money than my neighbors? Have I made more money or sold more books than other writers? Can I run faster? Can I write faster? Can I be skinnier or whatever? All of this kind of quantified self is about commodifying myself as a product on the supermarket shelf. And that takes you, to this whole concept of brand you. Yeah, yeah. And of course, anybody who's spent any time in marketing will know the famous mantra, which is around the 3 C's of branding, which are consistency, consistency, and consistency. Well, guess what? Human beings aren't consistent. Cornflakes are consistent. So there's your choice. What do you want to be? Do you want to be the cornflakes on the supermarket shelf, or do you want to be a human being?
Yeah.
That's your choice.
Yeah.
Personally, I don't like the idea of brand you, and I'm very struck that creative people so frequently change,
Mm.
and their fans get irate.
Yes. Yeah.
What do you mean Beyonce's doing country music? God, they hated it when Miles Davis went electronic. All this kind of stuff, or when Bob Dylan didn't, all this kind of thing. But actually, because artists are hugely driven to explore new territory,
Mm.
they change all the time.
Yeah.
And that's life, that's growing, that's developing, it's exploring new territory. It's thrilling. So I find this whole idea of brand you and how I can commodify myself and sell myself as long as I'm consistent, inherently anti-human and anti-freedom. I think it's a trap. So
Yeah.
it's I don't really want to be a product. And although I earn my living by what I write and talk about, um, I don't really think I'm a business that's just marketing itself in order to boost my bank balance. It is not relevant to the choices that I make about what I do, what I write about, where I work, who I work with.
It's so funny, isn't it? There's really this kind of, and this is something that I've come up year after year after year, this conversation that we haven't had the same conversation every year, but we return to it frequently. A good friend of mine who I respect a great deal, and he is very creative and he grows and he's philosophical and he runs a branding agency or a brand consultancy. And he often will say to me, almost verbatim what you've said, but for the inverse, basically says, "Oh yeah, if you want to be recognized and build your brand awareness, you have to just stick to one thing." And wasn't it great when you were doing web psychology and people could understand it? I was like, but that feels like death. It's kind of this very stagnant, ecosystems change. We have, depending on where you are in the world, in the Northern Hemisphere, you have seasons. In Costa Rica, where my partner's from, you have wetter seasons and drier seasons. Even if there's seemingly minimal change, there is still always change. And I think it kind of feeds back into what we've touched on a few times in this conversation around complexity and adaptability and responsiveness to life as it's
Yeah,
unfolding,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
especially as it becomes less predictable. So I'd love to ask you, what are some of the skills or practices that you would encourage folks to maybe engage in order to relate with uncertainty and unpredictability in a way that is more generative?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think the basic premise I would start with is there is more to you than you know.
Yeah.
So try something different, read something different, go somewhere different. I mean, we all talk about loving travel, right? But there are many different ways to travel.
Yeah.
I mean, the wonderful, wonderful Polish writer Olga Tokarczuk wrote a brilliant book called Flights, which is about travel. And it really is a very expansive sense of travel. Tourists, she says, just conduct raids. They just land on a place, grab the goodies, and go. Right?
Yeah. Yeah.
One of the things I do is I made a decision some years ago that I didn't really like tourism very much. I didn't like it much in other people, and I didn't like it in myself. And I just wanted to get to know one country really, 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 really well. And so, and after big discussions with my family, we decided, right, it was going to be Italy because we could get there by train, we would learn Italian, that every summer we go to Italy, and every summer we go somewhere different in Italy.
Oh, how lovely.
And the deeper we go, the less we understand, because there's so much more, everywhere we go, we spend a long time there. And when we leave, we think, but we've only touched the surface.
Yeah.
We will keep doing this, I'm pretty sure, for the rest of my life. And I will end up feeling I should have started going to Italy when I was younger. It's just, so I'm I'm not saying this is what everyone should do.
Mm-hmm.
This is just my thing. I've reached a stage in my life where I would rather go deep than broad.
Mm-hmm.
It's more rewarding to me.
Mm.
And the deeper I go, the more I find. And, who knows? Maybe at some point I'll think, that's it. I'm done. I know everything about Italy. But you know what?
Don't think so.
I don't think so. I just don't get that feeling.
Yeah. But it comes back. I mean, there's a quality of, there's something about speaking to the beauty of intimacy and commitment there,
Yeah.
and curiosity and attention, which you've mentioned at various different points and in different ways in our conversation. And I think there's also, and again, this comes back to creativity, like the way that we choose to attend to the world with our time, which is our life force, like it equates to the same thing, says a lot about who we are. And I think a lot about what we receive in return. And so I'm curious, before I get to the last question, which is where people can find you, which I'll obviously include in the show notes, but for people who like to hear it orally, I'll include it. I'd love to ask, what are your, when you kind of feel into where we are at the moment, what are your biggest hopes that you hold for humanity, and what do you feel are the biggest risks?
Well, I mean, my hope for humanity is that we successfully renegotiate our relationship with nature.
Yeah.
That we accept that dominating it is going to kill us.
Yeah.
And we fix that. I don't. If you ask me to assign a probability to that happening, it would be below 50% today. But I'm by nature an optimist, so I passionately hope that I'm wrong.
Yeah.
I think our lust for dominance has proved pretty much a disaster.
Mm-hmm.
And if we can't kick the habit, it will kick us.
Yeah, for sure.
Basically. But, my more positive vision is we do figure it out, and we do take a more humble position within the natural universe and survive.
Yeah.
And survive to continue creating, inventing, and discovering the phenomenal things that we've discovered and invented over the last 3,000 years.
Yeah. And then, given that you're someone, I think, especially who engages very deeply in these sorts of questions, and you dedicate your life in so many different ways to this, I would guess that sometimes it can feel quite full and overwhelming, or at least intense. I don't know, maybe that's massive projection. But how do you orient yourself towards life and vitality and beauty when things get painful?
Mostly I go cycling. Because even at my worst, I know it's going to make me feel better. So that's a big necessity in my life.
Yeah.
I'll go cycling or swimming. And I'll read.
Lovely.
Because and I'm not saying this is a recipe for everyone, but when I read something that really gets my brain whizzing, just everything seems possible.
Yeah.
Whether it's a poem, whether it's a piece of nonfiction, whether it's a play. I'm just so excited by possibilities. And ready to go again.
Wonderful. Thank you. So, for people who want to find you, where would you like to direct them? And I'll include all of these links in the show notes too.
Well, the easiest place to find me is on my website, which is just www.mheffernan.com. I now have a Substack, which I started at the beginning of the year. So you can find me on Substack,
I'll include the link.
just under Margaret Heffernan, or it's called On the Level. Those are the best places to find me. And if you Google me, I'm just all over the place in all sorts of various iterations.
All right, wonderful. Well, that was just a really heart-opening and stimulating conversation. Thank you so much for your generosity.
Well, thank you for just a wonderful conversation. It's a joy.